Hello viewers, good day and welcome to Biology with Omotayo. Nice having you around. Just like you all know, we have rounded up the first mother topic we started with on this channel. That was classification of living things. In the course of examining that topic, we looked at the 5 kingdoms. We further went on to lay emphasis on the 3 divisions of kingdom plantae, and then went on to lay further emphasis on the 9 phyla of kingdom Animalia. This later led us to further examination of classes associated with phylum Chordata, and from there we generally went on to look at unique characters of members of the various classes under that very phylum Chordata. So we looked at characteristics of physis, of amphibians, of reptilia, of apes, and then of mammalia. Before rounding up that very segment, we equally examined a few practice questions together before rounding up that very content. Now we are picking on a new task, and before us is a new topic, and the topic right before us is the cell. Yes, the cell. We will start examining this one step at a time. A quick one, an introduction. Just like we all know, when it comes to issue of the cell, you will be quickly held back to start thinking about how to bring it to comparison with what you know. Well, simply put, it is the simplest form of life. Yes, the cell. It is the basic structural functional unit of life. Yes. However, before I go into details with regards to what we have before us, permit me to quickly give you a breakdown on what we will be looking at under this very topic, the cell. Okay, so one, we will be starting with the cell as a living thing. Yes, we will be starting with cell as a unit, as a basic unit of living organisms. That is to say, cell as living unit of organism. That will be our first subtopic to do justice to. After which, we will move on to look at forms in which cells exist. Okay, forms in which cells exist, basically in living things for sure. And then later on, we'll go on to look at the cell structure. Afterward, we'll move on to the structures and the functions. So we won't just be looking at these cell structures, we'll be looking at the various structures and their function. And lastly, which will be the 5th subtopic, we will be going on to look at the differences between the plant cell and the animal cell. So a quick one, just like I have earlier said, we will be starting right away by looking at cell as a living unit of organisms. Cell as a living unit of organisms. Now, before we go on, a quick one. Earlier, I was making effort to define the term cell, and I said cell is the structural functional unit of life, the basic structural functional unit of all living organisms. Okay, however, when you look at the topic here, we are equally having living units. Okay, living units of organisms. That is to say, this word living must equally be defined. What does it mean for a thing to be living? When do we come to conclusion that a thing is living? What and what? Aside the common characteristics of living things that we know, aside those characters, what else are we to look out for us to be able to draw a conclusion that a thing is living? Now, one, for a thing to be regarded as living, it must have a cellular structure. it must have cellular organization. For a thing to be regarded as a living thing, it must have cellular organization. Secondly, such a thing must equally be having demand for energy with which it carries out metabolic processes. I repeat, firstly, such a thing must have a cellular organization. Secondly, such a thing must have demand for energy with which it facilitates metabolism. And from elementary classes, we've learned that metabolism is made up of anabolism and catabolism. Anabolism basically having to do with building up processes within a living organism, whereas catabolism have to do with breaking down processes within a living organism. And for growth to occur, you know for sure that anabolism must be greater than catabolism. So one, it must have a cellular structure, it must have cellular organization. Two, demand for energy with which metabolism is being facilitated. Secondly, such a thing must have the ability to grow or develop. And from what I said earlier, for issue of growth, that means in such a thing, the rate of anabolism should be greater than catabolism so that there will be what? Growth. At the same time, for a thing to be tagged as living, such a thing must have the ability to transmit genetic information. Should have the ability to be able to pass on genetic information. And lastly, such a thing should have the ability to maintain a constant, a stable internal environment, that is homeostasis. So, a quick one. For a thing to be termed as a living thing, it must have a cellular organization. Such a thing must have demand for energy with which it facilitates metabolism. Okay, such a thing should have the ability to ensure growth and development. Such a thing should equally have the ability to transmit genetic information. And then lastly, it should have the ability to maintain a stable internal environment. Now, coming back to our topic, cell as a living unit of organisms. That is to say, cell is to be examined as the basic structure with which organisms that have the set characteristics of living organisms can come to be. And so, quickly, let us look at the topic now collectively in detail. Cell as a living unit of living organism. Earlier, I said cell is the basic structural and functional unit of life. It is the simplest form of life. It is the simplest level at which life can exist. Now, permit me to quickly bring this to our notice that living organisms can be classified based on the number of cells, yes, that such an organism possesses. Okay, classification of living organisms based on number of cells. One, we have what we call acellular. Yes, I repeat, acellular. For acellular, okay, for acellular organisms, these are organisms that actually lacks an organized cell structure. They cannot really be said to be at a cellular level of operation. Such organisms, in fact, are somewhere in between being a particle and being a cell. And a very prominent example of scenario where we have acellular cases is when you are looking at the virus. Remember, the virus is always being defined as a intracellular parasite capable of replicating within a suitable host. Yes, the virus is always defined as an obligate intracellular parasite capable of replicating within a suitable host. In fact, we refer to it as particle. Oftentimes, we refer to it as virion particle, a viral particle, and so on. Why? The level of organization in the collection that makes up what we refer to as a virus cannot in any way be compared to the type of organization we have in a cell. No wonder this very viral particle, or virion or virus as we call it, you will agree with me that it is always referred to as the bridge between the living and the dead. It has characteristics of both living and non-living things. So it is somewhere in between. It is not at a cellular level. Other example of other particles or components or aggregates of particles that we can equally refer to be examples under this very acellular group are viroid. Okay, for the viroid, it is a subviral particle that lacks protein coats. Okay, so it's a subviral particle that lacks a protein coat. In same way, we have what we call the prion. Okay, for the prion as well, it is equally a subviral particle without genetic material. Okay, so at this very phase of acellular, the organisms here in question are not really referred to as living things. Rather, you can see the choice of our word oftentimes referring to the examples as particles or other words that does not really depict a living thing. And as I said earlier, the viruses always referred to as a bridge between living and non-living things. So still, under classification of living organisms based on number of cells, the next is unicellular. Unicellular. Okay, organisms made up of only one cell. Okay, these are organisms that are made up of just one cell. And examples of organisms here we have. Okay, we have examples of organisms like the amoeba, the paramecium, euglena, chlamydomonas, a lot, trypanosome, and so on. Okay, so here you have a single cell having all it takes to function as a living organism. Next, we have the ones grouped as the multicellular organisms. Here you have organisms that consist of two or more cells for them to function independently and carry out all processes of life. So, examples of multicellular organisms, the examples abound, several. You can start with our flowering plants. You can start with even our rats. The very common day-to-day organisms we interface with, majority of them are examples under multicellular, including man, goat, cows, and so on, etc., fishes, birds, and so on. So, now, having looked at classification of living organisms based on number of cells, we will now go on to look at what then is the cell itself. Remember, we started by looking at cell as a living unit of organisms, and we went on to define the word cell, at least in a summarized way. Equally went on to define living, what it entails for a thing to be termed living. After which, we now moved in to look at classification of living organisms based on number of cells. Now, we will examine the cell proper and see what and what makes up what is referred to as a cell, the rules and basic details that guides the concept of cell. Come along with me. Okay, now the cell proper. We'll start with definition. The cell, as I defined earlier, the cell is the basic structural functional unit of life. That is a very simple definition that can easily be recalled. Moving on from here, now what and what makes up this cell? Now, the cell basically is made up of protoplasm and membrane. I repeat, protoplasm and membrane. Permit me to illustrate this. Now, a cell has a nucleus. The nucleus controls all activities of the cell. It is referred to as the basic driver, the basic engine room of a cell. It is the basis of genetic information. It is the one that instructs and drives all activities of the cell, that is the nucleus. And then we have a cytoplasm, regions around the nucleus, where we have several other organelles suspended. Just like in living organisms, we have different components called organs that makes up an organism. In same vein, cells have different components called organelles. These organelles are suspended in the cytoplasm, and then all these are encased by a membrane. And so, in summary, we can say a cell is made up of cytoplasm, nucleus, and membrane. And then come to think about it, cytoplasm and nucleus gives us what we call a protoplasm, which means I will equally be correct to say again that a cell is made up of protoplasm and membrane. Then you keep wondering, protoplasm, what is protoplasm? Protoplasm is the living component of the cell. Protoplasm is the living component of the cell. So the protoplasm, or living component of the cell, encased in a membrane, gives us what you can refer to as the cell, which means I will be correct to write the cell equals to protoplasm and membrane. Then the question, what is the protoplasm? Okay, just I defined earlier, so the protoplasm is the living component of the cell. Then the next question, why then do we refer to the cell as the basic unit of life? Yes, why then is it referred to as the basic unit of life? Because this is the cell is the simplest form that can carry out the various characteristics of living things as we have identified much earlier. From our elementary classes in basic science and intermediate science, integrated science, or whatever name it had been called, whatever form of name it had been given, you will discover that from elementary classes we learned about characteristics of living things. Also here on this channel, we examine characteristics of living things where we looked at Mr. Niger DAC. I won't be going into that details. If you seek to know what it entails, Mr. Mr. Niger NIGER DAC DAC as against Mr. Niger D, there have been a further advancement. If you seek to know what it is, please, you can visit previous lessons and you will know what the detail is. But a quick one, aside just characteristics of living thing, the cell has ability that all living things are said to possess. Earlier, we said for a thing to be termed as being living, there must be organized structure. For it to be termed as being living, there must be demand for energy with which metabolic activities is being carried out. We said for a cell, for a thing to equally be tagged as living, it must have the ability to transmit genetic material among several other things. And as you can see, the structure we have here has the capacity to do that perfectly. It has the capacity to grow, to adapt. It has the capacity to feed, to reproduce. It has the capacity to break down, to carry out breaking down processes, building up processes, and so on and so forth. And so, with this, details have been done to the concept of the cell. Now, if we will move on from here, we will be moving on to the cell theory. However, this will be happening in our next episode. Is that understood? So, from the next episode, we will move on to look at the cell theory, various scientists that worked to bring about the cell theory and carried out various discoveries with regards to the cell, and then from there, we will build on. Thank you for coming this far with the class today. Thank you for joining us on Biology with Omotayo. Endeavor to like the video, endeavor to equally share the video. invite others to join us as well, so that collectively we all will learn and become better citizens, having greater value to dispense as we journey on this path of life. Thank you. See you next class. Thank you. From the intricate working of the cells to classification of living things, from the mechanism